So we need to talk about a couple of, well, plenty about the years from 1600s through 1763. There's plenty to say. Um, what you also really need to remember is that the things that happened in the mother country, and this is for any mother country, if it's France or Spain or wherever, um, if it happens in the mother country, the colonies are automatically drawn into it. So if there was a war between England and France, the colonies in North America were also dragged into it. So the fighting would spill over into the colonies, and the economic issues would also spill over. So the economics in the colonies were directly related to what was going on in the mother country. So that's one issue that the colonists have from the beginning, is they don't want to be dragged into. England is continuously at war for so many years that it's like they love being at war. And so the colonies got tired of being dragged into everything. So that's one thing that you need to remember. So France in the New World, there were they were involved in 4 wars in Europe in less than 80 years. There were 9 world wars that France was involved in. The American people were unable to stay out of any of them. So when we talk about we have a long history of being involved in putting our nose in, it goes back to colonial days. You know, we talk about we're involved in everybody's business, it seems sometimes. And so we have a long history of that. This war was another world war. It was known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, but it was called the French and Indian War in the United States, or not, what is not in the United States now, in America back then in the colonies. It was called the French and Indian War. But it took place, it affected the English colonies, it affected around the world. So France was late to the New World, just like England was. Spain had been the beginning, but this edict granted limited religious toleration for French Protestants or Huguenots. Okay, so France does very well without wars because they're not involved. They were the strongest, they were the most feared nation in Europe at this time, much to the chagrin of England. There's always been a great competition between those two countries. So you have King Louis the 14th and his friends. King Louis the 14th, he was in power for 72 years, from the time he was 5 years old. And he was most interested in overseas colonization, not just in North America. So this is Louis the 14th. He sent Samuel de Champlain and other French explorers to the New World. In 1608, France establishes the first permanent settlement at Quebec. And this is Samuel, and he is known as the father of New France. He establishes good relations with the Huron Indians of the upper Midwest. The French explore all the way up towards Nova Scotia and what is now Nova Scotia, and they sail down the St. Lawrence River and end up in basically the backcountry at the Great Lakes region, and they get involved in the fur trade with the Native Americans. Beaver fur, beaver pelts were high fashion at the time. They made hats out of them in Europe. They made coats and all sorts of clothing. So it was in high demand, so there was lots of money to be made. The French joined the Huron Indians in their battles against their Indian foes, or their enemies. And those foes were basically the Iroquois tribes of the upper New York area, what is now upper New York, and the Iroquois eventually will be backed by the British. So the Iroquois blocked French expansion into what is upstate New York now. And after that, the Iroquois allied with the British as well. So New France, it was controlled by the king after these commercial companies failed. Where the joint stock companies in England worked, these companies did not in France. So it was a almost completely autocratic rule, meaning the king was in charge. There were no representative assemblies. They had no right to jury trial. And so by 1750, only 60,000 people were living in New France, which is a small number compared to the hundreds of thousands that were living in the British colonies. So, and really things were pretty good in France. So they didn't really have a reason to leave. The French didn't really care about going anywhere else. Things were not so good in Great Britain and England, so they had a reason to leave. So these Protestant Huguenots were denied refuge in the colony, so they didn't have a reason to leave. And France was more interested in their sugar colonies. They were actually the more lucrative colonies, the rum, because you make sugar. You need sugar to make molasses and molasses to make rum. So that's a pretty big draw for the French in the Caribbean. Now, the British colonies in the Caribbean were also sugar colonies, and they were actually more lucrative as well. So, um, so they both groups like the Caribbean colonial idea. So this beaver trade, this is an image of a beaver hat, and then you see Benjamin Franklin wearing his beaver hat. And what he did was when he goes to be a diplomat in France, trying to get the French to back the Patriots in the war against England in the American Revolution, the French were reluctant to do so because they didn't want to make things worse, and they didn't want to support the Patriots if they were going to lose it. And so they were a hard sell. Eventually, the French do support the Patriots, but it takes a lot of work, diplomatic work on the part of Benjamin Franklin to get that to happen. So anyway, Benjamin Franklin wears these beaver hats so that because the French think incorrectly, believe the stereotype that all American colonists wear these beaver hats, and they don't. And they like to kind of poke fun at him and sort of make fun that he's a hillbilly, so to speak, from the colonies. In fact, he's brilliant, but he's willing to play the part to, ingratiate himself with them, trying to get support for the war, financial and military support for the revolution. So you'll see this picture, this image of him many times. These are just beaver pelts that are hung up. This is just an image so that you could see the beaver pelts. These traders were French. The French were just not that much into stealing the land from the Native Americans, and so they really got along with the Native Americans much better than the English did, because the English were so intent upon taking the land and expanding, whereas the French, they were there to trade, and then wanted to go home, except for there were some missionaries, but not that much. So you had these traders. They were free spenders. They were young. They were men. They didn't have families here. They were free to be you and me, and they were all about partying basically. So the Native Americans kind of like that. So the Indians recruited these guys, and Indians were recruited, and these canoes arrived at Montreal in 1693. These Native Americans, poor things, they were decimated by disease just like all the other Native Americans. They were ruined by alcohol just like the other Native Americans that we spoke about in Georgia and the other colonies as well. This whole colonization, it weakened the traditional Indian way of life. They became dependent upon European goods because that's what they wanted. They became dependent upon rum, and because of the alcoholism, and they were fractured more and more as tribes. They were run out of their own land. Their hunting and fishing, and their whole culture, all their cultures were basically weakened as a part of this colonization. The Europeans, as with everything else, they want more and more and more, and so they basically eradicated the beaver population, and that eradication, or it made them endangered. Basically, they didn't have that distinction, but they basically destroyed the beaver population, and that then affected the ecosystem in incalculable ways. There were missionaries, they were Jesuit, so Catholic missionaries, and they were saving Indians for Christ and from the fur traders as well. They weren't too successful in converting Indians, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but they were very useful as geographers and explorers. So they were making maps and they were exploring the territory while they were out trying to save these Native Americans from being heathens. And that's their take on the reason they were converting these guys. But this is the thing: why were they not so successful? And this is across the board: Spanish missionaries, English missionaries to a lesser extent, and because the English were not so big on conversion as they were on making money. There were some, but they gave basically lip service to missionary work. They said they were, but they were there for missionary work, but not so much. And then the French were there for missionary work as well. And the reason is because it's very difficult to get people to give up their traditional religious beliefs and practices. It is almost impossible, and this is research that shows that you can't really change people's beliefs that they are raised with from birth. If your mama did it, your grandma did it, your granddaddy believed it, all this, you're basically not going to come in and tell these people that because we say it, this is the way it is, and you're supposed to believe it. Give up all your religious practices and come be like us, be Catholic. There's not really a point for that. It doesn't work, and they also have found that the enslaved people from Africa, up to 20% of them, this is recent research too, up to 20% of the enslaved people who were brought here from Africa were actually Muslim. And there was a very strong Muslim community in Africa, particularly in Eastern Africa, but it moved west. And so many of these enslaved people were Muslim. Nobody ever looked for them, as far as they never looked closely enough. They just assumed they were quote unquote pagan, and nobody looked to see that they were actually Muslim. All that being said, the Native Americans either would say that they were converted, even though they really weren't, and then they would go on about their business and revert to their own practices, or they would assimilate Christian principles and elements of religious rituals and those kinds of things. They would incorporate parts of Christianity into their own beliefs that they had originally. And so there were assimilations, and it was like a mingling of the religions. And if you know about AME churches, African Methodist Episcopal churches, those churches are a result of this mingling from the enslaved people, where they merged African religion along with Christian elements and came up with this whole new denomination, so to speak. So there were missionaries. Let me go back one, sorry. So you had Antoine Cadillac, notice the car, founded Detroit to stop the English from colonizing there in 1701. And then you have Robert de La Salle, who claimed the Mississippi River for France in 1682 from the Great Lakes all the way to the Gulf. Notice there was a car named the La Salle car way on back in the early 20th century as well. So there's a lot, you can see these names, the names that you recognize in day-to-day life, the Cadillac at least. And I know this La Salle because I was around back in I'm old enough to know that, know about the La Salle. they had posts up and down the Mississippi, up in Mississippi and Louisiana to control the river. They wanted to block Spain from using the river. So whoever had the control of the Mississippi River and the port there at New Orleans in 1718 was a big deal, because they could float the the goods or whatever it was that they wanted to trade. If it was, plants or food or lumber or beaver pelts, they could float it down the river a lot easier than they could ship it on wagons or on horseback or whatever. The water, you have to remember too, that the rivers were the interstate highways of the day, because so much of this land was wilderness and there were no roads. And so if you had to be near a river, and they floated this grain down the Mississippi River to be shipped out to the West Indies for the enslaved population in the West Indies and for the citizens in Europe. You have a clash of these empires. You have a war in the late 1600s, King William's War. You have Queen Anne's War in 1702. And those wars spill over into the colonies. And so there are skirmishes and fighting with Indian allies on either side as well. There was not really any military support here because they were so focused in Europe, they were so focused on the war there, that the colonists and the Indians practiced guerrilla warfare. The colonists learned the guerrilla warfare from the Native Americans. So this impacts the French and Indian War, because the colonists then have learned in these two wars, they've learned guerrilla warfare, and the European soldiers have not learned that warfare. So they're in open field warfare, where you meet face to face in a field and you just start killing each other. So the European soldiers do not understand guerrilla warfare, which makes a big difference in the French and Indian War and in the American Revolution. So the French and their Indian allies burned down British settlements on the frontier in the back country. Back country is a term that refers to the land that is more than 50 miles off of the eastern seaboard, more than 50 miles from the water. So that is called back country. And so Deerfield, Massachusetts would be one of those places. It's a settlement. It's right there in the Berkshires in Massachusetts. And there's a huge Indian raid there in the early 1700s. And so that's one of the worst Indian massacres ever. Spain allies with France and antagonizes England, and so you have wars or skirmishes going on here with Queen Anne's War as well. The Treaty of Utrecht are the peace terms for the Queen Anne's War in 1713. Britain gets Acadia, Newfoundland, and Hudson Bay, which that's all Canadian, what is now Canada. France, and the reason this is important is that France sees the beginning of the end of its presence in North America. When Britain gets this, France sees that it's going to be a long process, but they're not going to have a presence in North America long term. Britain gives the colonies salutary neglect. And this has been going on for all of the late 1600s and into the early 1700s, where as long as they're providing, like we said in the other video, as long as the colonies are providing goods to be sold or goods to be the raw goods for manufacturing in England, everybody's happy. They're not paying much attention to the colonies. Britain also wins limited trading rights with Spanish America, and then that begins to be a problem because of the smuggling. Well, the colonists have been smuggling to the Caribbean for years, and they continue to do so because it helps them to avoid paying what they see as high taxes And so they just smuggle goods out and they don't have to deal with the British government. And really, there's nothing Britain can do about it because the king's not there to enforce it. That also becomes an issue as we get towards the Revolution. So you have the Battle of Jenkins' Ear in 1739. And this happens on St. Simon's Island, actually. The War of Jenkins' Ear is the British versus the Spaniards. They fight on St. Simon's and in the Caribbean. And this war merges with the War of Austrian Succession. And then you have Spain and France are allied against England. Well, England goes and invades New France up at Louisbourg, which is in Canada, what is now Canada. This peace treaty of 1748 gives Louisbourg back to the French. Well, they're mad. The colonists are ticked off because the British government gives Louisbourg back. The colonists had fought very hard to seize Louisbourg. And so the British government gives it back to the French without even consulting the colonists, of course. And so they're mad. The reason is the colonists are threatened by the French in Louisbourg because it's right there at what is now Maine. And so they're in close proximity. So the French can be attacking the English in the colonies in no time. And so France is still there in North America. So this resentment is still there in 1754. So you have that bad feeling on the part of the colonies. They feel like that their wishes were neglected or ignored by the king. Also, there's this anti-Catholic sentiment going on, and the colonists in Massachusetts basically do not like, and in all the colonies, they don't like the fact that there are French Catholics there. Remember the anti-Catholic sentiment going on from the time of King Henry VIII in the 1540s. So they had this resentment going on as well as because of the Catholics as well. So you have 21-year-old George Washington. So you need a map for this. So here are the colonies. They are, and notice Georgia looks different now than it did then. The Spaniards were this far up, and then the French were here. So you have this Appalachian mountain range, okay? So you've got all of this, and this is where everybody out here is either French or they're Indians. So this is where the British colonies stop. There are a few, there's some settlement, but not much, because they know that they're risking their lives by going out there because of the risk of Indian massacre. Well, the French have been coming, they've been here for ages. They would sail here all the way up, come down the St. Lawrence River, and then they're all connected into all these Great Lakes regions, so they could move around on water without ever having to cross these mountains that were covered in wilderness. I mean, there was no way to move. So they handled all of their travel through water on these Great Lakes. Well, more and more, the British colonists want to move across this crest of the Appalachians into the Ohio Valley, the Ohio River Valley. Well, the French are also coming down because they're sort of expanding their, making their presence known here as well. Well, Virginia's governor, Robert Dinwiddie, sends George Washington. Now you got to remember, George Washington is basically one of the richest men in Virginia by this time. And so he is involved in land speculation. Well, what they would do is they would go out here and get this free land, and then they would divide it up. And George Washington, remember, he was a surveyor. So he could go out here and survey this land for no money, and because he could do it himself. And then they would divide this land into farms and sell it at a really nice price to the people back in Virginia who wanted to move over into this part of the country because they wanted to expand their holdings and they wanted to increase their wealth. So Washington is sent by Governor Dinwiddie out to the Ohio country to tell these French to move off their land, that this is Great Britain's land. Because Dinwiddie, George Washington, and several other businessmen are all involved in a land speculation deal. So this is enriching the governor as well as some of the private citizens in Virginia. George Washington is 21 years old and he doesn't quite understand what he's doing. So he comes and he comes out here, and what is Ohio country is actually now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But anyway, it's Fort Duquesne was there. And so eventually it was there. So he goes out and he tells these people they got to go. Well, these military guys, they're just laughing. They're soldiers. They're just laughing. It's like, no, we're not going. So they have issues. And it turns out that Washington goes and builds a fort called Fort Necessity. Now, this is 1754. And so he builds Fort Necessity. Well, anybody knows that if you want to have military success, you don't want to be down in a hole in a valley. You want to be on top so that you can see what's going on below you. You don't want people being able to fire down on you from the hills into the valley. Well, he is a novice and has no idea what he's doing, so he goes at 21. He takes 200 men out here that Dinwiddie sent with him, and he builds this Fort Necessity, which is basically a shack. There's a 10-hour fight. George Washington surrenders, and he ends up triggering a world war, which is a really bad thing. Washington and his 200 men are allowed to go home, and the French just laugh and say, don't do it again, but they're really mad. So in Europe, Britain and Prussia ally together, and then you have France, Spain, Russia, and Austria, and they are all on the other side. Well, you can imagine all the numbers of colonies that these different places have, these different countries have, and how many people are involved in this. The French had wasted so much of their strength in Europe, they didn't really think so much about the colonies in America. So it becomes a different kind of war. They're fighting more in Europe than here. So Britain sends leadership, they send supplies, munitions, cannon, and all, and it's a very expensive war for the British. This crisis demands that the colonies that had been functioning as separate entities, they were all settled under different purposes, different conditions, and at different times. And so they all basically were functioning as 13 different states, so to speak. They weren't unified. So this crisis requires that they unify. So they have a Congress at Albany, New York in 1754. 7 of 13 colonies send delegates. And this is the first intercolonial meeting that happens in the colonies. So it's a pretty big deal. They were trying to keep the Iroquois loyal to the British colonies. So every time there's a meeting with Native Americans, the Native Americans go home with wagon loads full of gifts. Guns, pots, pans, beads, clothing, all kinds of things that they can distribute to their own tribes and that they can trade. So they go home with 30 wagon loads of gifts. Now, the Native Americans liked the British goods better than the French goods. They said the British goods were better made, they were more valuable. The French goods, they kind of fell apart, they were cheap, so they weren't too excited about those. So they were decided to be, the Iroquois decided they would be loyal to the British because their goods were better. So that was one part of this, the reason for this meeting. The other part was to be more unified, to bolster this common defense against France, and to come together. Well, now this image is a cartoon that Benjamin Franklin created for the Pennsylvania Gazette, which was his newspaper, which was the first newspaper in the colonies. And it was a month before the Congress met. And the point of this is that it is usually, it's assumed to be an image from the American Revolution. In fact, it is not. It is from the French and Indian War. He created it to show the snake that if we're not all together, then we die, because we're split. South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and then New England. So that's all the New England states there. So this is actually, that's for trivia night one night. This is actually a French and Indian War image that Franklin created himself. So they send General Edward Braddock from England to command this group of people. Now Washington goes back out, but he's a junior officer, so he's a captain, so he can't really do anything else. And in the British Army, if you were a colonist, if you were not a noble, you could not go any higher than captain. So this will be a point for Washington, because you got to remember, Washington was still a British subject, and he saw himself as a British subject. He realized that his military career was not going anywhere farther than a captain, excuse me, if he fought in the Revolution on the side of the British. So he goes, and after this war, he says, oh, I can move higher than that. So he goes and he decides to fight for the Patriot side, partially because his military career looked more hopeful, because he could earn more promotions that way. You could only go to captain if you were a colonist in the British Army. So anyway, the opening battles for the British were terrible. Edward Braddock has him, George Washington, a large group of regulars are sent to Virginia. They didn't have a whole lot of supplies. They go out in 1755 with 2,000 men. They're supposed to capture Fort Duquesne, which is at the where right now, basically where the Pittsburgh Pirates Stadium is. The field is now on the river. Well, you had a large part of this force that was colonial militia. They were untrained. They were badly disciplined, meaning they were not military trained. They were called buckskins, and they were because they wore their own clothes. They didn't have uniforms. They brought their own guns. They brought their own ammunition. They brought their own food. The colonial militia was just a group of men, and they were not ever trained. They would go out and they would function like a reserve, like Army Reserves does now, on one weekend a month or whatever. But basically what it was they would sit around the campfire and chew the fat, so to speak. They didn't train. They were just basically getting away from their wives for the weekend, and they elected their officers. So the officers weren't going to make them do anything that wasn't fun, because they wanted to be reelected as leadership in the militia. So they were not trained. They were badly disciplined. They did not know anything about what they were doing, and they were fighting alongside the best trained soldiers in the world, who were the British regulars. And so the British regulars made fun of them a lot, because they talked about them being basically hillbillies, which would be the buckskin part, and the behind the tree methods, meaning guerrilla warfare. Back in the day, of course, the British were only fighting in open fields, and they had huge losses of men, but it was a totally different fighting style. So there was a smaller French and Indian army, and they were successful at first um, during um, this particular battle. They were in the forest. They had this the advantage, and Braddock is mortally wounded. They have horrible losses, and I'm going to upload a video as a clip from a movie that will explain, that will show you how what the advantages and disadvantages were in this kind of battle. It's not this particular battle, but it's the idea behind it and the techniques that were good for the French and the Native Americans, and the ones that were not so good for the British, of course. So Braddock, let me back up. Braddock, this man, is mortally wounded. He dies at the time, and George Washington is tasked with bringing the men back from that battle, and so they retreat, and the war rocks on for a while. And you have intermittent fighting. You have to remember, in the winters they couldn't fight because it was too cold and it was icy and the rivers froze over. And this is the same thing that happened in the American Revolution as well. So you only had a few months a year that you could fight. So it's a longer war. It was a good thing for the Indians, because the whole frontier from Pennsylvania to North Carolina was undefended, basically. George Washington, with 300 men, tried to defend the whole frontier, and they couldn't do it. Local authorities resorted to offering $50 for a female scalp and $100 for a male scalp for any colonist who could come up with a scalp. And in 1756, the British have a full-scale invasion of Canada. They attack multiple undefended outposts when they really should have been focusing on Quebec and Montreal. England sends William Pitt, the great commoner. He was not this is William, sorry. This is William Pitt. He was admired by everyone. They loved William Pitt. So in 1757, they sent him. He was a big shot in London. He concentrates on victory in Quebec and Montreal. He picked young and energetic military leaders. His expedition against Louisbourg in 1758 regains Louisbourg for the British, and this is the big significant victory for the British in this war. Up until then, for 2 years, it had been basically loss after loss. You have the Battle of Quebec. It's on the Plains of Abraham in 1759. Britain has Pitts, who is here, and Montcalm for France, who is on the right. Montreal falls in 1760. France is gone from Canada permanently. It is under British control. Peace comes to the interior in 1760. Basically, fighting is over. However, the peace agreement at Paris doesn't happen till 1763, because the fighting continues in the rest of the world. For our purposes, the war was over basically 1760, but you have to know that 1763 was the actual peace agreement. French were gone from this continent. They did leave behind the French population that we said was about 60,000. The French were allowed to retain several small islands, sugar islands, two small islands in the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. They were not fortified, but they were there as fishing stations for for trading purposes, and um, they ceded to Spain their ally, all of Mississippi, Louisiana, and New Orleans. So these colonies change hands over time between France and Britain and Spain. So they change hands. That's why you have all these cultures in Louisiana and New Orleans, particularly now, because it changed hands so many times. Spain turns over Florida to the British in return for Cuba. So Spain gets Cuba, and the British get Florida, which adds to their colonial holdings, because Havana during this war had been taken over by the British. So Spain wants Havana back, and they're growing tobacco and sugar there. Britain becomes the dominant power in North America and the leading naval power in the world. However, what did this do for the colonists? It increased their confidence in their own military strength, but maybe not. Maybe it was because the British regulars were there. The colonists had fought along the best trained soldiers in the world, so they were very impressed with themselves. They were like, "Oh, we can hang out with these military experts," and it also had allowed the colonists to get to know each other, and they realized that they had more in common than they had thought, because this is the first time that the colonists were forced to actually talk to each other on a person-to-person level, on an individual level. And they, if you're fighting next to somebody, you get to know them and you live with them day in and day out. So the colonists decided that they actually had more in common than they thought. It also shattered the myth of British invincibility. The colonists see that the British are not as great as they thought they were. And so if they can lose in battle, then that changes the perspective of the colonists, because they see the weaknesses. And it makes it so that possibly, we might be able to win. And they're not thinking this way at the beginning. When they finish this war in 1760, they are never prouder than then to be Americans. They're never prouder than at that time to be British subjects. They are excited. They have tossed the French government out of North America. So they've gotten rid of, quote unquote, those Catholics, quote unquote. And so they're very proud to be British. They're not thinking independence at this point at all. The British refuse to recognize any colonial rank above captain. So that really kind of ticks the colonists off, because no matter what you do, you can't advance in the British military. You had General Wolfe, who says that colonial militias, and this is a quote from him, "in general, the dirtiest, most contemptible, cowardly dogs that you can conceive." So you see that there's an arrogance about the Brits that are not going to endear them to the colonists at all. They saw themselves, the colonists saw themselves as hardworking people, and they were advancing the cause of British civilization on the frontier. They saw themselves as doing the hard work, and they did not appreciate this rude attitude. They thought that they deserved credit because they were risking their lives to fight for the colonies, for the British government. And so the British officials saw this colonial reluctance, meaning the colonials had not always ponied up their quotas. They had quotas per colony. You were based on your population. You were supposed to send, however many militiamen to the front to fight. Well, the colonists, particularly in Georgia and South Carolina, didn't really have a dog in that fight. So they didn't send their quotas. And then also you had issues because these people were not paid. The colonial militia were bringing their own clothes, their own food, their own arms and ammunition. They were not rich people. And so they were doing this on their own time. And there were times of the year when they couldn't send anybody because they were at home working their own farms. So you always have this issue, and this same issue will go into the Revolution as well, because there's no standing army in the colonies. As far as colonists in an army that's always there, there's nothing else in the colonies except the militia. So the British officials think that this is, they're not pleased with the colonists in this respect. They also were not pleased that American shippers were smuggling to their enemies, meaning they were trading with the French in the Caribbean because they could get better prices than they could if they shipped it to Britain. So they could get better prices if they went to the Caribbean and traded with the French there. So, and even the Dutch. So the British were not pleased with this because they saw the colonists as, traitors basically for not trading only with Britain. And we'll talk about mercantilism another time. At this time, they forbade the export of all supplies from New England and the middle colonies. Colonists refused to provide troops and money for the conflict. They wanted the demands for and rights of, they demanded rights and privileges of English without the duties and responsibilities of the Englishmen. These are the issues that are coming up after the war that are going to lead us down the road to revolution. Pitt offers to reimburse these colonies for a large part of their expenditures, and the colonials will come up with that. They'll come up with their people if they're going to be reimbursed. But the question for the British is, if they had to be bribed to move against an enemy, would they ever unite and strike against the mother country? They're thinking not. The British are thinking the colonists will never revolt, because if they wouldn't even fight against a common foe, how are they going to revolt against us? This colonial disunity, though, had been present from the beginning because of distance. I mean, you have these geographical barriers. You also have conflicting religions that are very diverse, from Catholics all the way to Quakers as far as the spectrum of religious belief. You have a lot of nationalities. These British colonies are not only inhabited by Brits, they're inhabited by Germans, Dutch, and so on, Austrians. All sorts of different nationalities are represented here. And so they have all these different groups. You have different kinds of colonial governments. Colony to colony is different. These people were fighting. They would fight over 1.5 feet of land. And so they had boundary disputes a lot. They had the resentment of these backcountry settlers against the aristocratic bigwigs in the East, the plantation owners, the businessmen in New England, those kinds of people. So you have this resentment going on there. There was some unity that was achieved as a result of the French and Indian War, but there were still a lot of different issues. After the troops go home, the Indians are still there in the Ohio country. Now it's just minus the French. The balance of the power between the tribes and the British is changed. The French up and left their Indian allies, the Huron, with no thought whatsoever. They just left. And so that leaves the Huron and the Iroquois and the British all to figure out how those alliances are going to work. And so the Native Americans didn't have anybody else to play each other off of. Spain is out of Florida temporarily. France is off the continent, and the British are in charge. So things change. However, we have Pontiac's Rebellion, and I had to just show you this nice picture of this Pontiac. And it's not this Pontiac, it's this Pontiac. This is Pontiac. He was an Ottawa chief. He led several tribes in an attack against the British right after the peace treaty and right after the evacuation of the French to try to get the British out of the Ohio country. They overran all but 3 British outposts west of the Appalachians, killed 2,000 soldiers and settlers. And so Pontiac's Rebellion was actually pretty successful. The British retaliate with smallpox blankets. Smallpox blankets were blankets that had been used to cover smallpox victims. And so those germs were then on those. And it's the first example of germ warfare. But they knew that the smallpox blankets would transmit the disease, and this had happened with the Indians as well. They crushed this uprising. They have a truce. Pontiac dies in 1769. He's killed by another chief. This is the end of that rebellion. However, you have the Proclamation of 1763. So these land-hungry colonists, they had been itching to move west. That had been the whole point of this war for them. The colonists just wanted to move west. So they wanted the French and the Indians out of the Ohio country, everything west of the Appalachians. Well, the problem is, after these 2,000 people are killed, the king says, oh, no, 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 no. Something has to stop here. He can't afford to have the entire couple of thousand mile border, the frontier, defended with British regulars. He can't afford to keep British regulars there indefinitely. So he issues this proclamation of 1763. This establishes the proclamation line, which prohibits settlement anywhere west of the Appalachians. This line is imaginary, of course, but it runs down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. Well, this makes the colonists very mad. They said, we've fought this war so that we could move west. And the king says it's not stopped. It was not designed to stop settlement. It was designed to prevent Indian attacks on the frontier, to prevent other uprisings like Pontiac's rebellion. However, the colonists didn't see it this way. The colonists thought that it was a slap in their face. They end up moving west anyway, and they take their chances with Indian attacks, and there are Indian attacks, on a repeated basis because the Indians are mad that they're there. So the proclamation line doesn't actually work, but it does serve to tick the colonists off that this proclamation line is there after as they saw it, they had fought so hard to win the right to move west. 1765, you have 1,000 wagons that are rolling through Salisbury, North Carolina on their way up west. They have total disregard for British rule in America, and that is a bad sign for the future. So 1765 is a pretty big deal. The war caused the colonists to see themselves and their whole destiny differently. The path was cleared for the way west. The birth rate was high. Young, energetic settlers lived here, because if you're old, you're not probably going to move to the colonies. So you had young, energetic settlers. There were lots of people being born. The population was booming, so that means that they need more and more land. They have a way to go west. And the Britons at home have the big heads because they defeated the French and the Spanish in North America. They were not in the mood to put up with these rebellious colonists. They were already ticked off with already annoyed with the unruly colonial subjects, and this is where it sets up for the road to revolution.